Hi guys, apparently I am live. Who is here waiting for people? Apparently my Instagram is letting people know that this event has happened. Hello Curious Noosh, I see you, I'm waving at you. Hello Charmaine, hi, how are you? Shout out to my book club members and crew. I see you there, Steph, hands up. Brilliant. I'm so excited. Guys, I'm going to wait a few minutes, and unfortunately for you guys, you're going to have to hear me talk for a bit because I just can't bring Tawssef out like this. I've got to make sure there are individuals who are here to hear the knowledge that he has going about his book, which I'm so excited to talk about. And I just feel sorry for all my friends and my networks because I have been talking about this book for a while. Hi, Charmaine. Hi, Kathy as well. Oh my gosh. Book club crew are out here in numbers. Brilliant. So, yeah, the Muslim problem. Why we're wrong about Islam and why it matters. And it matters a great deal. And like I said, guys, I'm going to give you a few minutes because I just can't bring him out like this, man. He's got to see a few more people. But whilst we're here, some people know me, some people don't. But essentially, I'm Liz. I'm the person that posts on this Instagram all the time. I am the founder of the BIPOC Bookcase. BIPOC, for those who don't know, stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Colour. And I just think maybe I'm dreaming in my head, but I honestly believe we can get to a post-racial society, but we're not going to get there if we don't have the knowledge, the information and the humility to learn and understand. So for me, this is my first live, so I thought this is a great platform to really get into the book, really. And also as well, for me, you know, this book is really pertinent, and something like it says on this book is, you know, like why it matters. And just really quickly, one of my really good friends when I was at university, he was a Muslim, and I feel like, because obviously I was born in Nigeria, but raised in South London, was quite a Christian network, essentially. All my friends were basically Christians or ducking and diving, not going to church on a Sunday because they had a hangover on the Saturday night or something. So I never really had a real enduring, lasting relationship with people of the Muslim faith. And it wasn't until I went to university that I had a friend who was Muslim. And at the start, it was like great, someone to go house parties with, banter, life was good. And I just saw him as he and I as one and the same. And I remember maybe not our second year of uni, this one distinctive house party. And obviously at the time I drank. And I remember he asked for a Coke and I asked for rum and Coke. And I accidentally gave him the rum and Coke. Guys, don't cuss me out. I accidentally gave him the rum and Coke. And I remember him just spitting it out and being like, Liz, you gave me the wrong drink. And I was just like, what's the big deal? And by the way, you've messed up my shoes, man. What's the big deal? And then by having that issue, we were able to really talk about his faith and what it means to him. And I think on reflection, I was probably about 20, 21 at the time. And it just made me think to myself, well, if I don't understand his religion properly or only understand it on a superficial level, and it's something that's really important to him, essentially I'm failing to see the whole of him, and particularly something that's so integral to him. So for me, that's when I really started just thinking I need to learn more about other religions. So some people are like, oh, Liz, are you Muslim now? I'm like, no, I'm not Muslim. I'm barely Christian. My parents are always looking for me like, Liz, it's Sunday, we ain't seen you in church. So it's not about me having a particular affiliation to the religion. It's just more about me wanting to understand people's beliefs that are really important to people in my life. So that's a bit of a ramble. But you know what, guys? You didn't come here to hear about my stories at university, which is probably a good thing. You come here to talk about his book, innit? So I'm going to bring him on really quickly right now. But before I do that, I just really want to say, break down who this guy is. Like, one, he's a qualified solicitor. So guys, I need some flames up in the chat. Hi Mo, I see you there. And he's a qualified solicitor. He specialises in immigration and asylum law. He's been a human rights activist for over 10 years. Also as well, he's really Dr. Khan because he does have a doctorate in experience, which he did on the experiences of asylum seekers within the UK immigration system. And he's also the proud recipient of the 2017 Northern Writers Award. So we've got a highly acclaimed person that's got a few minutes for us. So I see him and I'm going to put him in there. And I'm sure he would say as well that he is because he is from Manchester. So let's see. Hi, Phil. I see you there. Book Club crew. See you. So I've asked him to come. I hope he's accepting it. Oh my God. Woo, you're here. How are
I mean,
you? How did I do?
you did so good. I was more listening to you than talking, to be honest.
I was making sure I got all your credentials, man, because you're a serious guy. You're a serious guy.
I'm all right. I'm all right. I'm just in my best.
Like I said, guys, this is the book. People are gonna get annoyed because I'm gonna be plugging this book harder than you because I just think it is. Thank you. It is knowledge that everyone needs to read. So here we go. I'll talk a bit about myself, and I just want to just really kind of just get into it because we're going to be busting 5 myths about Islam and
Let's do it.
asking the questions that people don't really want to ask or too scared to ask. But first of all, I just want to ask you. For me, I knew there was a black problem when at 7 years old, my white friends could go into the corner shop here and just be wilding out in a corner
Mm.
shop and it was fine. But me, I got an escort around the corner shop because of 10p sweets. And I thought, why do I get the escort and my white friends don't? And I remember going home and thinking to my dad about it, and he was just like, Liz, this is racism. And I remember being 7 and 8. So I just wondered for you, when was the first time you thought, wow, like, there's a Muslim problem out here?
Mm. Maybe really late, to be honest, because I went to a primary school that was like majority POC. So in my class of like 36 kids, there were 2 white kids. The
Wow.
rest of us were either Pakistani or Bengali or Jamaican. So we were like, it was kind of a cocoon to not really be aware of race to some extent, apart from when, the white kids call me something like an ethnic slur or whatever. But I didn't really know like not to be Muslim, or I didn't really live in a non kind of Muslim area. So I was always a little bit like mollycoddled
Yeah.
in terms of the way that Islam is perceived in Britain. And so I said it was only like when I was 14 years old, when 9/11 happened, that it really kind of like hit home. Oh, okay. So this is actually what it's like. So I remember like being at my dad's workplace when I was 14, the day of 9/11
Mm.
happened. And I went to school the next day, and like, I heard about it on the news, and our secretary told us what happened. Went to school the next day, and we had this huge assembly in our class, and everybody was kind of like asked to speak. And at some
Mm.
point, my teacher's like, "Oh, why don't, like, what do you think what happened about what happened? And like, what's your thoughts on it?" And I'm like, I'm 14 years old. I have no idea. I don't know what to make of this. But I know in that moment, I felt like at some point I was either made to feel responsible, or I felt responsible for what was happening, or for what had happened. And that felt like this really heavy, weighty feeling. And I didn't really know how to place it. And so, like, for me in the book, and I would say just generally in my life, I would say that 9/11 is the point at which I realized that, all right, so this is what it means to be Muslim. It's incredibly negative. People have all of these preconceived ideas about you, and maybe they had them before as well. But 9/11 is the thing that really like sent everything into a whole new kind of like level in terms of like Islamophobia that exists, or in terms of people having almost like entirely negative opinions about Muslims in not just Britain, but also kind of like all around the West, I'd say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So essentially, you're saying you're part of a crew of people of color. Then 2001 came and you stepped out into the wilderness. Would you say that? And
It
that's
felt like the wilderness, yeah, for sure. It was scary as, and it was like all of a sudden you've got to figure out who you are, you've got to figure out how you feel, you've got to figure out like what people are saying about you and what your opinion is about it. And so the interesting thing about 9/11 is that like if we think about British newspapers, like they went from writing almost nothing about Muslims producing 300% more articles about us. Right? So if you think about the Guardian, the Sun, the Mirror, everybody is producing 300% more. So all we're ever hearing about is Muslims, Muslims this, Muslims that, migrants this, migrants that, ethnic people this, ethnic people that. So you're getting like negative stories about Muslim communities all the time. And half the time, like, you don't even know what you believe, or you don't even know if it's true. So somebody says like, some of the things that I talk about in the book, like you get this thrown at you in some way in the newspaper, and you have no idea what your opinion is or whether it's true or not. And so often, like, you end up just thinking, okay, well, it must be true because the newspaper's saying it. When you're that age, you don't really have the faculties to be able to break that shit down. And so for me, like, for most of my teen years after 9/11, and for a lot of my 20s, I just took on all the crap things that people said about Muslims and about Muslim communities. You know, they say that we're violent. I'm like, yeah, we must be. They say we don't integrate. I'm like, okay, we must be. They say we're sexist, we're homophobic, we're transphobic. I'm like, okay, like, yeah, maybe they've got a point. Like, and I would be angry at my community, be angry at myself for being Muslim, and that stuff is not healthy, you know?
It isn't healthy, and you kind of like those are myths we're going to go into do a deep dive on, and there's more people joining in. And I want to say, guys, on the bottom on the right there is a question mark. We're going to do a Q&A right at the end, so as we go, if you want to put a question in, press that that question mark and put a question in, and we'll try and get through to it as soon as possible. We're only doing 45 minutes because you guys only need the next 15 minutes to buy the book, which is a link on my bio. So I'm doing all the plugging, and I'm paid. I'm loving it. But okay, so obviously you talked a lot about the self-hate that occurred because of this massive incident, but somehow you were able to negotiate that identity and actually write the book. I mean, what made you like, you know what, I'm going to write this book?
Well, you know, so if you think about it, like even when I was figuring this stuff out, I spent my 20s like going into Muslim organizations and spending time with other Muslims and trying to negotiate my religious identity. So on the one hand, I kind of like felt like I knew I was Muslim and I belonged to that religion, but at the same time, I don't really know what I believe and I don't feel comfortable to be a part of the tradition and of the religious community. So there's always this kind of tension going on within me, and I would go and like spend time with other Muslims, try and find like my crew, my people, you know, people who would understand me, and maybe they would help me to figure all of this stuff out. And some people did, but it took a really long time to do that. And so, like, one of the things I actually ended up doing was instead of figuring this stuff out, was just like becoming an activist and helping other people, you know, on various Muslim issues. And then slowly, like within that process, the more that I learned or the more that I read, like I managed to figure that stuff out. And so it's only when I left that stuff behind when I was about, so I'm quite old, I'm 34, but I was about, for me, I feel old, but I was about 30 at the time when I left that stuff behind, and I was thinking, okay, so like, where do I go next? Like, what happens now? I had all this kind of experience of what young Muslims were going through, and my own experience, and I was like, okay, maybe I need to do something. Like, do I still have something to contribute to the world? And then I read a book and I thought, it was like a book about young Muslims. It's called Letter to a Young Muslim. And this guy is like writing to his kids that this is how to be a good Muslim, right? And almost everything that he wrote was about how not to become an extremist or how not to be a terrorist. And I'm like, okay, this is so crap because there are so many other things that Muslims kind of like need to deal with and need help with, rather than just like, oh, don't be a terrorist. You know, I thought it was really basic, reductive stuff. And so I was like bitching about with my friends about the book, and they were like, well, why don't you write something? So I thought, why don't I write something? And so then I started like working on a book proposal, and it took ages for me to kind of like figure out the idea and for it to become the thing that it became. But before that, the attacks in Manchester happened, you know, the Manchester Arena bombing. And so that was like a huge, huge thing for me because I'm born and raised in Manchester and I still live here. And I very, very nearly went to that concert, to the Ariana Grande concert. So I was like, you know, feeling like this is really close to home. This is really personal. I could have been there. My friends and all of us are like, just like frozen when the thing happened, frozen watching the thing on television, you know, seeing the places that we recognize on TV, texting each other. You know, the weeks afterwards, we're thinking about like, you know, there were all these like massive statements of solidarity, but like all Mancunians coming together and singing Oasis and stuff like that. But then you've also got people saying the same Islamophobic crap that I've seen for years and years and years. So for me, like the Manchester Arena attacks became the thing where I was like, okay, I need to do something. I need to write something. So almost like the day after, or a couple of days after, I had my proposal and I sent it to loads of agents. I was like, it feels really important for me to do something now because I can see for myself and for like my friends, we feel like we're stuck on, you know, like on all these different sides. Like there are people who are constantly questioning whether we belong here. And then we've got people in the community who are making us feel crap about, you know, so I was angry with the guy for doing it, but I was angry with like wider society for the Islamophobia that they were giving us. And I needed a way to kind of navigate all of this stuff, not just for myself, but for other people. And so then I was like, okay, so I'm going to write this book. And then that kind of kickstarted the process to go and get the book published. So that was like 2017. And it's been fairly quick because books actually take ages and ages to be published, but it was really quick. And I wrote the book in 9 months, which is also a really silly thing to do.
You birthed that book. You birthed it in 9 months.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
I think that's inspiring what you said, because the thing is, though, there's so many people who are just, especially people of colour, BIPOC people, we're so downtrodden by the racism, the insinuation, being predators, that some of us in a book I know at the moment called Black Fatigue, like we get fatigued about this. And I think it's amazing that you were able to transform all this negativity to be like, you know what, I'm going to make this a teachable moment for me to explore my faith and what it means to people, but also to teach other people that actually your identity isn't one note. It isn't you're just a suicide bomber. Actually, you've got so much more going and so much more to teach. So again, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
No, you did touch on Islamophobia, and in your book, you boldly assert that Islamophobia is racism. I just wondered if for many people out here, they may not understand Islamophobia. So could you define what Islamophobia is and also its connection to racism?
Definitely. So for me, Islamophobia is hatred that is directed at either like an expression of Muslimness or a perceived expression of Muslimness, right? So it's really targeted at Muslim people about who they are, how they express themselves, what they believe, and how they live their lives. But the question we often get is that Islamophobia is not real because it's not a type of racism. Muslims are not a race. Islam is not a race, and all of this sort of stuff, which is fine, but it's also a load of crap in the sense that, like, we know for a fact that race is a social construct. We know for a fact that racism changes and evolves all the time. So, like, race and racism has always existed for the powerful to exert their power over the less powerful. It's a tool of what? White supremacy. And so we as Muslims are like experiencing this particular kind of racism. One, because Islamophobia is aimed at seeing us all as one, right? So I talk in the book about how we are racialized, right? Mm-hmm. We are treated as one race. It doesn't matter that we all have different color skin. It doesn't matter that we come from different cultures, speak different languages. We are treated as one. We're treated as homogenous, that we all practice and believe and do the same things, right? And that's why a lot of the kind of negative crap that we get is all very kind of essentialist and like Muslims are like this, Muslims are like this, Muslims are like this. But at the same time, we also, like, racism is about power, and we don't have any power. We don't have any power to change the way that, the discourse happens around us. Where, in a place like Britain or in the West, we're a tiny minority, and we can't really change the way that we are perceived. It's like the way that we are perceived comes from the top down, comes from the white man onto us. And I'd say that the last thing that I think about racism, I'm going to check my notes just to be sure, is that...
Question, put it in the questions. Check your notes.
Pardon? Say it again?
Your notes?
Yes.
Anticipate. Yeah. Go for it.
The other thing about it is that, like, people say that Islamophobia is not a thing, but you can not be Muslim and still be subjected to Islamophobia, right? So, for example, like, why do Sikh men get subjected to Islamophobia, or when often they get subjected to racist attacks, they're perceived to be Muslims? Why? It's because the turban is often seen to be a symbol of Muslims, and they're being attacked not because they are Muslim, but because they seem to be Muslim. So it's the way that Muslims are constructed as this single thing that means that, Islamophobia is real. And I always think that when people say, oh, but Islamophobia is not real, we should be asking, like, why? Why are you interested in denying something? Because for me as a Muslim and for Muslim communities, they want to develop a term to try and describe the way in which they are mistreated or they are spoken about. And if a community is trying to do that to try and, like, figure out or negotiate their relationship with the wider world, are you trying to deny that in order to deny the kind of bigotry that you feel or the things that you want to say? You want to be able to say them unchecked. I think that's definitely the case a lot of the time, if not all the time. So often I'm not interested in, like, why people don't think that like Islamophobia thing. I'm not interested in justifying myself. I'm more interested in why they are interested in and so determined to deny the existence of Islamophobia as a real thing.
Thank you for that. And you really broke it down, because I'm in a lot of black spaces, people always like racism, people, racial gaslighting, people don't understand it. It's really hard, racism and so forth. But I feel like by you stating essentially Islamophobia is another form of it, I think some people, maybe from people of color, will understand that a bit more, because I know it's more seen maybe in the maybe East Asian community, but I feel as well in the Southeast Asian that, you guys are the model, like, minorities. You guys, become doctors. Again, these are massive stereotypes. You guys are, if anyone's going to treat us, people of color better, it's the Asians and the Chinese and, the Malaysians and so forth. And I just think it's very interesting that you said Islamophobia is racism, and you guys are still experiencing the way everyone who is in the BIPOC community is.
Yeah, exactly. And imagine if you're white, right? Like, you're not going to think that a white person is going to subject to racism. But imagine if you're white and then you declare that you're Muslim, right? Kind of treatment that you can get. That also proves that Islamophobia is a thing. It's a sticky subject because, like, it's hard for us to compute how can a white person be subject to Islamophobia when they're not, they're not a person of color. But it's the way that Muslims are conceived to be a single group of people that is the issue, I would say.
Absolutely. And somebody in the comment, Nikki in the comments, she said that she's got a Muslim sounding name, and so she gets, assumed to be Muslim as well. And in your book you state that being Muslim and brown is like being black twice. Exactly what you said in your book. So
I didn't say it, somebody else said it.
Sorry, but you put it in your book, shall I say? And I think that's a powerful statement.
Yeah, it was I think an African American Muslim imam who said that to be in America and to be black and Muslim is like being black twice. That there, like, you have this whole level of kind of like the apparatus of racism in America of being black, and then imagine that you're Muslim on top of that, and all of the kind of crap that you get, and all the surveillance and all of the kind of stuff that comes on top of that. There is this like duality. So I mean, that's something that I talk about a lot in the book, that there's a duality to people, for people who are black and Muslim. There is a duality to that experience. And actually, they have an experience of this sort of stuff that is much older and much longer than us. Like, to be black and Muslim in America is to have been like doubly marked the whole time,
Absolutely. Thank you for correcting that. And now I think we need to go into the myth busting element of things. Guys, we've got that we are going to bust in this live today. It's going to be a teachable learning experience. Like I said, on the bottom right, there is a question mark. If you would like to ask questions, we have a Q&A at the end. And for those who just come in, we're talking about the Muslim problem. The link on my bio to buy the book. It's published by Atlantic. And also, everything we're going to discuss is in this book. All 5 myths we're going to talk about in this book. I can't say, I'm going to say it until I lose my voice. Buy the book, guys. So the first myth that's out there is that, they say Muslims don't integrate. You guys are over there, the British people are over there.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that?
I say that's not true. I would say that the statistics show that Muslims do integrate. So there's this really interesting study that was done in 2017 by the Bertelsmann Foundation, which shows that in terms of language, education, employment, social and emotional connections. So they looked at 5 different countries in Europe, and they looked at these 5 different things: so language, education, social and emotional connections, employment. And they found that on the whole, Muslims are integrated in those societies. So that's like France, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, the UK. We are integrated, but also like integration is increasing with every generation. So, with every successive generation, people have better employment opportunities, they have a better grasp of the language, they have a better connection to the country that they live in. So the idea that Muslims don't integrate is false. But I would say that when we talk about integration and the idea that Muslims don't integrate, we've got to think about what does that mean, right? The idea of integration, the way that we talk about it in Britain, always is this, that the person from the outside is a person who has to come and adapt to the people already living here. And I'm sorry, but integration doesn't work like that. Integration for me is about creating social harmony. It's about us creating communities that enjoy being together and have, that create productive societies. And that involves all of us. It doesn't involve the kind of like minority community changing to make the majority community happy. And unfortunately, that's kind of how we talk about integration here. It's as if the government doesn't have to do anything. It's as if white people don't have to do anything. It's just a person who's coming here who has to change themselves in order to be accepted. And I would say that, like, well, that's one part of it. But the other part of it is that we also have to then think about what are they asking of us? Often when people talk about integration and that Muslims don't integrate, what they say is that we don't change ourselves so that we look like the majority, right? So that we don't, drink, that we're supposed to drink, we're supposed to go to church, we're supposed to eat pork, and so on. But that's kind of not how, integration really works. Integration is about us creating harmonious societies. And it's also about thinking about what we can all do for each other. So for me, the really interesting thing is that, like, in Britain, the government has never made a integration policy, right? So they're supposed to have like documents and policies and plans to think about how our societies are working and moving forward in the future, and they don't have any of this stuff. And yet places like Germany and Australia do. They think really hard about, okay, well, what does a multicultural society look like? What does a multi-ethnic society look like? What does it involve for us to be living from different communities but side by side? How do we make sure that, we all care about each other and we all give and take? And I think that that's the thing that's lacking in Britain, is that conversation of, well, this is a give and take. For example, we always talk about like Muslim ghettos as if like Muslims all live by themselves and, the white people are always over there. But if you look at the statistics, actually, the thing that's really big, more than Muslim ghettos, is the existence of white flight. Yeah. The idea that white people will move out of a particular area because they don't like living with ethnic minorities. So I would say that, like, on the whole, Muslims are integrated. When they aren't, we've got to ask why. And maybe that's because we're asking something of them, like, give up your culture, give up your way of life, that we shouldn't be asking them. But also maybe there are like social and economic issues that are also not allowing them to get ahead. And so we know in Britain, like, even though we've had this race report, we know that structural racism exists. And we know that structural racism exists also for Muslim people, that if you have a Muslim sounding name, you're less likely to get ahead. If you have a Muslim sounding name where you look a certain way, you are less likely to have certain opportunities. And it's actually like something like 50% of Muslims in Britain live in the 10 most economically deprived areas. So when we talk about integration, we also have to talk about, do Muslims have the same economic, social opportunities as everybody else? The answer often is no. So that's kind of my response to that.
Thank you for that. You broke that down. I mean, again, apparently, you guys aren't about British values. Apparently, you guys don't even celebrate Christmas. Like, can you break that down and tell me about your own experience?
I love talking about Christmas, actually, because when I was a kid, my parents were very much like, we don't celebrate Christmas at home. And it's funny because, it's only in the last few years that I have an experience of being in Britain for Christmas, because every year we would go to Pakistan and we would go and visit our family and my grandparents and so on. So Christmas was never really a thing that we did until a few years ago, when we started staying at home. We started doing Christmas dinners, right? And it became a very natural thing for us to do a Christmas dinner, like 30, 40 of my family who are all in Britain, get round, we all cook like different parts of the meal, and we all get together and we have this massive, massive meal. There are times when, over the last few years, I've said to my parents, oh, like, me and my brother want to have presents, right? I want this, I want this, I want this. This is my Christmas list. My brother's like, yeah, I want this, this, and this. My parents are like, that's fine. So the interesting thing for me with Christmas is that, like, over the years, when my parents at the very beginning were not really into it, I think that they were afraid of us, like, losing who we are and losing our culture. But once they figured out that we're okay, and we have a really strong sense of who we are, they have kind of embraced Christmas as this tradition that doesn't have to mean that we're Christian, doesn't have to mean that we're endorsing the Christian way of life or Christian beliefs, but it can be a way of us, like, participating in the country that we live in. Like, everybody's getting together, so we're getting together as well. And it's also the days when everybody's off, so why not? So it's really interesting, that Christmas is this. And often there are Muslims who don't want to celebrate Christmas because they don't feel that it's compatible. But I think that that's often about Muslims trying to figure out that question of, well, how do we be Muslim in a society that's not Muslim, you know? And how do we show that we believe in God or show our devotion to God in a society that doesn't allow for that? You know, often it seems like in Britain we're moving to becoming a godless society, and we don't have space to talk about like people who do have space. So I think that can be an interesting tension. And the interesting thing I think with like British values also is this thing is like the government and its institutions like constantly say this, like, oh, British values this, British values that. But what does it actually mean, right? Nobody actually really says what it means. And when they do, it's like the same things that everybody else believes in. It's like free speech, it's democracy, it's human rights. Like it's respect for other people, it's tolerance, it's diversity, it's all of those things. But why are these things British? Why is it not that they're universal, you know? And I think that when people constantly talk about these ideas of British values, we have to think about why are they saying them and to what end. And often British values are used as a way of doing two things. Either they're a way of like stigmatizing Muslim or other communities by saying that you're foreign or you don't belong or you can't belong, or it's about like punishing them, right? So like often in schools, for example, like British values are a way to like almost like crack down and demean on Muslim kids. So there'll be this whole thing of like, oh, well, wearing the veil, for a child to wear the veil is not consistent with British values. Or, you know, if a child comes to school and says that they don't think that LGBT people are okay, that's against British values. It's British values to teach those kids and, you know, all of that sort of stuff, which is fine. But why can't we just teach these kids to respect people without it being a British thing, you know?
Absolutely.
And then right? And the interesting thing about all of that stuff is that when you look at the statistics, all around the world, everybody values the same things. Everybody values human rights. Everybody values democracy. Everybody wants to live in a country where you have free and fair elections and due process and an independent court and all of those things. Those things are not just British or Western. They're valued by everybody all over the world. So when we start talking about like the separation of values as if Britain thinks and feels a certain way and the rest of the world thinks and feels a different way, like these things are really set out to divide us, and they're set out to make us feel like we don't belong. And they do that with lots of different parts of the world, right? They do that with, you know, they do that with like the Middle East, they do that with Sub-Saharan Africa, they do that with like America and the Caribbean. But like all these places value the same things, you know, and that's for me the thing that's I think really interesting about this. Yeah.
Absolutely. You went in, guys. We put some flames in the comments and hand claps because you are just dropping the knowledge, and all because dropping the knowledge. That means I got to buy the book. But I was going to say as well, like just two things from that area that I really found fascinating. I think you said, please correct me if I'm wrong, that actually Muslims actually had a democratic system 600 years before England did. Correct? What you wrote in the book.
Yeah, there's evidence, for example, of let's say the court system, right? The modern court system in terms of having the witnesses and the judge and all of that stuff, like that was kind of invented in Britain, but there are equivalents of this stuff in like Islamic societies like hundreds of years ago, or there are examples of, you know, like the constitution. In Britain, we think of like the Magna Carta as like the first ever example of a demarcated relationship between the king and his subjects, right? And it sets out the rights of the king versus the rights of the subjects. But we also have the Constitution of Medina, which is, again, like 800 years older. So this idea that for example, like democracy, for example, belongs to the West is not something that I believe in. When we really start thinking about, like, you know, it's kind of quite complicated, but in the book I start thinking about, like, well, how did Britain achieve democracy, right? It's at the expense of like, you know, other people's bodies and other people's rights. So in order to give people rights in this country, they had to deny people rights elsewhere. And in order to do that, they also had to take from elsewhere. So the conversation around, like, who does democracy and human rights and all this stuff actually belong to? It doesn't belong to them, it belongs to everybody.
Absolutely. And I think we need to get on to the next myth that we're going to bust. And this one can be quite an interesting one. The word on the street, apparently according to the Sun paper, and, you know, I mean, it's not my thing. I'm just saying what they're claiming, you know, Muslims are violent. They're saying, you know, you Muslims are violent. We need to be scared of you. When we get on the tube, we need to put on be scared if you got a rucksack and a beard. Like, that's what they're saying. And I mean, first thoughts on that statement.
I think that when when a group of people say that, oh, that community is something, we should ask ourselves why, right? Like, what are they trying to hide about themselves, or what are they projecting about themselves? And so the idea that like Muslims are violent or a violent people is really, really old. It goes back as far as like the kind of medieval times, right? When Europe first encountered Muslims and didn't really like them, didn't really understand them, felt threatened by them. So they're like, oh, you're really violent, right? You're violent, you're savage, you're barbaric, blah, 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 blah. And so when I talk about like the stereotype of Islam is violent or Muslims are violent, it's for me a stereotype that has its roots in medieval times. But I would say that like human beings are violent, right? And we've not been able to have a proper conversation about why humans are really drawn to being violent, to hurting each other, right? Like obviously there is this thing in Muslim communities where some people have gone on to do terrible things in the name of Islam, you know, all these terror attacks and joining ISIS and so on. But rather than saying that it's Islam that made them violent, we should be thinking about what kind of cultural, social, psychological process was it that made them do this. And when you start breaking this stuff down, you find that like people are drawn to violence for many things. Like there's a part of me that feels this stuff is innate in human beings, the need to hurt other people. But I also think that like when we are drawn to these sorts of movements, it's about way more. It's about like our need for ego, our need for power, our kind of like hopelessness about our own lives. It's about the way that like men want to like play with like guns and toys, and you know like the kind of conversations that we're not having about their emotional well-being in kind of like a very meaningless society, right? We live in this place that actually, you know, doesn't really have a lot of meaning beyond buy loads of shit, right? That's the kind of like religion in Britain now. Just buy loads of things, spend, 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 and everything will be okay. So I think that when we call Muslims violent, we're actually hiding the violence that we are guilty for. And I think that in the West, that's especially true. That like even if we just look in the last maybe 100 years, you know, there are so many violent things that the West is responsible for, whether it's like colonization and the genocide of various peoples, or whether it's the First and Second World Wars, or whether it's the situation in Afghanistan and Iraq and Somalia and so on. So I would say, yeah, like there is violence in Muslim communities, but I would say that there is no community that is free from violence. There's nobody who's like cracked the code on how to create a society or a community that is free from violence. I just don't think that Muslims are the exception in this.
Absolutely. And also just to add as well, like in your book, this book is, guys, like this book is heavily researched, man. I did a whole university course just reading this book. So if you're trying to get actually paying the 10,000 a year, like just buy this book and you'll be sorted on this particular subject. But in the book, I know you talked about, you know, violence, like the statistics show that men commit more violent acts than women, and something to reflect about in your book as well. You talked about how is there an issue with how men express emotions? Like men are told to crush every type of emotion, barring rage, and is that why it then manifests when people, not even just Muslims, just men in general, commit violent acts, because that's the only emotion they're allowed to express?
Definitely. I think that we live in a society, and maybe there are very few societies that are different, that cultivate rage in men. You know, there are very few ways in which men are allowed to express their emotions, and being angry and being, you know, overcompensating for your vulnerabilities is much preferable than saying like, yeah, sometimes I feel weak, sometimes I feel crap, and so on. And so I think that often, yeah, men are acting out of a need to compensate for certain things. And I think that we really need to have like more complicated conversations around men in general, right? Because we talk about toxic masculinity, and that's really useful. And we're talking about like the way in which men are responsible for like harming women and minorities. But we never talk about how like men are harmed by the patriarchy as well, right? And that's a really important and common thing, that men are also harmed by the expectations that are placed on them. And I think that that's also true in, you know, in Muslim communities. And I talk about that from the perspective of like within the faith, but also like outside, that, you know, the thing that Muslim men are dealing with is also kind of the same as what men in general are dealing with, which is like how do we like figure out how to live in a society where our traditional roles have gone, and yet we're still kind of expected to be tough and strong and angry, and like that's all really interesting and creates a lot of tension.
In your book, you really define what masculinity, what Islam says about masculinity, and my memory is bad, but it was something about how masculinity in the faith unites. Is it? I can't remember. Is it compassion with vulnerability?
I'm gonna find it.
Yeah, it was such a beautiful line. I just thought, I've done some of the works that I know, and somebody else in the comments said it as well about like, some of the most peaceful people they've met are Muslims, and that's my experience of it as well. But it was something like, masculinity in the Islamic faith unites. Did you find a line? Did you find it?
I found that bit at the end, which I find really, really lovely, which is that one day the Prophet's cousin, Prophet Muhammad's cousin, was walking by and he passed a group of men who were really deep in conversation. He asked them, "What are you doing?" And he says, and they say, "We are discussing manhood," right? So masculinity. And the Prophet's cousin replied, has God not told you everything that you need to know when he says that God commands justice and excellence? Justice is to have a sense of fairness and excellence, and it's to prefer others to yourself, right? What remains in masculinity after this? Mm-hmm. So what he's saying is that in the end, being a man is really about giving to other people, and is about being generous. And it's about thinking of others before you think of yourself. That is about being fair. It's about being just. It's not about being strong or being violent or showing off in a certain way or thinking about your ego. It's really about thinking of other people. And that, I think, is really inspiring. It's like, after that, what else is left? Nothing. That is masculinity.
And that is in your teachings, but people don't see that. They just see something totally different. So, guys, we're busting the myth here. Sarah, my old student from university, I can see her in here. She said it's beautiful what you wrote out. So, love you, Sarah. Yes. Let's go on to number 3. Look, apparently, Muslims are predators. Apparently, you guys, not only are you guys predators, you brown people, allegedly Muslims, are going on the streets. You're praying. You're looking for white women. And that's what you're looking for, to rape and abuse. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. This one is a really controversial one. So I want to be like very slow and thoughtful and gentle about this. Because as we know, like the idea of like grooming gangs and all of this stuff is so controversial. You say the wrong thing and people are just going to like be down your neck. I think that it's really interesting the way that Muslim men have been perceived for a really long time. And I think that they have always been perceived as sexual predators in a way. It's something that exists in the way that Muslims are described in like the medieval times. It also is part of this idea that, for example, Prophet Muhammad was a pedophile, and that's something that keeps coming up in right-wing languages.
When was that? He was 9 years old or something, right?
Exactly, right. And so that's kind of like one of the origins of it. The idea that the Prophet married somebody, a wife who was 9 years old. We don't know that for a fact. What the kind of like history books suggest, what the facts suggest, is that his wife was actually much older. That she was probably 19 or 20 years old when they married, not 9. But because of the way that, like historical records and things were kept, 1400 years ago, it's likely that some of this stuff has gotten like mixed up in translation. But the idea is that, she was probably 20 and not 9. But at the same time, I would say that when we think about this idea that the Prophet is a pedophile, it's often advanced like very, very specifically to Muslims without thinking about the way that cultural mores were so different back then. Like 1400 years ago, the way that like age of consent and like adulthood were conceived is very, very different. And actually they were very similar to the way that they were conceived here. So there are kings in Britain and France who married wives who were 12 years old, and they're like in their 40s. But we never make a point about them. We always use this one example, which might be right, might not be right in kind of Muslim history, to make this point about Muslims. And so the Muslim myth of like men being predators is one that has kind of evolved over the years. In kind of colonial times, what the kind of colonial powers did was to invent this idea that Muslim men were like sexually aggressive. And so you have all these like really interesting Victorian novels where like called The Lustful Turk and this and that, where you create this idea of like the non-white man as the one who's like the sexual savage,
Yeah.
right, who can't control his sexual urges and so on. So all of this stuff has been created at a specific time, and it's interesting for us to think about it at in a British context, because like when colonial powers experienced or first encountered Muslim societies when they first started colonizing and invading, they found that Muslim societies were way more sexually permissive and open than like Victorian societies were. Like Victorians were really frigid and really prim and very kind of sexually conservative, and Muslim societies, despite like perceptions, were the exact opposite. So they created all of these ideas about how like, you know, the women are like, you know, all beautiful and they have these harems, and you know, they all like sexualized, and you've got the men who are really like raging stallions and so on. So this stuff has really existed for a really long time, right? And then it kind of has like re-evolved in over the last few years with the stuff around.
I know what you're going to say, and I want to say to you, apparently there's this report in 2017 that said 84% of men who were grooming and sexually abusing women in England were of Pakistani Muslim origin.
Mm. Right. So it's worth saying with all of these like situations that people invoke now to say that Muslim men are sexually problematic or predators, that all of the attacks that happen are terrible, right? All sexual violence is awful. It goes without saying. And there are examples of the sex attacks happening in Cologne on New Year's Eve a couple of years ago. There's this whole idea that Malmö in Sweden, which is a city with lots of Muslim migrants, is like the rape capital of Europe. And then we've had this whole grooming gang crisis in Britain. And it's all interesting to look at these things and realize that when you unpick the statistics, a lot of it is false, right? So for example, this idea that like in Sweden, you know, Malmö is the rape capital of Europe, or that the areas that have received more migrants in Sweden are the ones with higher rape areas, isn't actually true. So there's no correlation between the places where the highest number of like rapes have happened and the areas with the highest number of like asylum seekers and Muslim migrants and so on. Like, you know, so the statistics suggest that, oh, it's, you know, this is the reason why, but actually there's no correlation. And this was a study done by the National like Crime Prevention Unit in Sweden, where they looked at all this stuff and saw that there was no correlation. Similarly in Britain, now the stuff with the grooming gang stuff is really difficult because the stories all came out in the UK and they were like pursued by a particular newspaper, but there were no statistics on this stuff, and there was no specific like legal offense that is specific to child grooming or grooming gangs, right, specifically. So, you know, like there are child sex offenses, but there are no grooming gang offenses in the law. So it's really hard to figure out like how many grooming cases have there been and who was responsible for them, right, in terms of like grooming gangs en masse. And so when the people came up with this like 84%, it's actually wrong. There are like professors and academics who I quote in the book who have analyzed that particular paper that says that 84% of groomers are like Pakistani or Muslim or Asian, and has said it's bad science. Like there is no statistic on this stuff, and the only statistics that we have available are from a company called Full Fact, which what they do is they kind of take the kind of figures that are bandied about in the public and they assess them. And they say that when it comes to child sex offenses, there is no spike or overrepresentation of Muslims in those communities. So the reality is that Muslims don't make up more child sex groomers or child sexual offenders than any other community. This stuff is like, has been inflated in a way to fuel this kind of like racial discourse around brown men attacking white women. And it's not a racial discourse, which a lot of the judges who prosecuted the cases have said that there's no racial element here. The reasons why a lot of these things happened was because the sense of availability, because a lot of the men were engaged in the nighttime economy, so they were like taxi drivers, or they were like worked at takeaways and so on. Like those were a lot of the reasons why. And when we have like this conversation, we keep saying,
had as well that those girls were very vulnerable. So it wasn't because they were white, as you said in your book. I'm quoting your book, by the way.
You are.
Yeah, see, I read it. See, I didn't read it. It's more to do with the fact that these individuals were vulnerable. So there was no one looking out for these individuals.
Yeah, and they took advantage of those situations. So it was kind of like a coalescing of all these different things, right? The vulnerability, the kind of like the nighttime economy, all of these things. But when we have like a racialized conversation about grooming gangs, we forget that in Britain we have an actual epidemic of child sexual abuse that we are not able to do anything about, because the racialized dynamic or the racialized discourse is distracting us from dealing with the reality. And what it also does is it suggests that only white women matter, when we know that also there are a lot of victims of grooming gangs or child sex grooming and so on who are women of color, and they're forgotten because they don't matter and they don't fit this narrative of the bad brown man attacking the vulnerable white woman, And so the conversation that becomes incredibly like paternalistic. It's about like white men defending white women from brown men, the evil brown man, and so on. And it's all really interesting because when we think about stuff like this, it's always like men of color, or it's always people of color who get like stamped, like the whole community gets stamped for the things that like one or a minority of people have done. So I call it like something I found in an academic piece, the mark of the plural, right? So just because like a group of people do something, the entire community gets tarred with that thing, right? And it's interesting now that like all Muslims or all Muslim communities are seen as like, like pedophiles or groomers or predators. All Muslim men are seen this way. Like I've been called a Muslim pedo, just because of the thing that's happened. And so the racialized dynamic is dangerous, but it's also untrue, because when we look at the statistics, there's just nothing to suggest that, only Asian men are either guilty of child sex offenses or are grooming, right? They're not the only ones grooming.
Absolutely. I think you broke it down very well.
So
ready for the next two more, guys? I'm passing two more facts. I mean, I've been told with Instagram Live that it cuts out after an hour. If it does, we're getting back on, because we're gonna finish this conversation. But just to let you know, we're on myth number 4. Have you got a bit of water? Yeah. Definitely. Apparently, Muslims, Islam, they're anti-women. They don't like women. They force women to wear burqas. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that men are crap, and that's why like the discourse around women's bodies and an obsession with women's bodies continues to take place.
Yes.
I think that when we talk about the place of like women and sexism and stuff in Islam, we should begin by talking about what the Quran says. And the Quran always affirms the equality of men and women, right? And like in the Quran, God basically tells us that he's not really interested in our gender. What he's interested in is who we are, how we live, what we do for other people, and we will all have an equal opportunity based on what we do to enter heaven, right? So actually, like the idea that, so like often in other faiths, like there's this idea that a woman is inferior because she was made from Adam's rib. We don't have that, right? There is no case of biological inferiority in Islam. That's not part of our kind of discourse. The Quran begins from this place that men and women are equal. They are people in the eyes of God who have an equal opportunity to go to heaven, right? But of course, like Islam has also done something really interesting, is that it has given women rights. So 1400 years ago, it gave women rights when they didn't have any. So it gave them the right to inherit, the right to own property, the right to divorce, the right to like give testimony as a witness in a trial or something like that. Like it gave women all of these rights when they didn't have any, and it gave women rights that like Western women didn't have, which is I think really important for us to acknowledge. But of course, like men are crap. So over the years, the discourse and dialogue around like women's place in Islam has always come under attack, right?
Yes.
And if you think about it this way, that when Islam gave women rights, it pissed a lot of men off. And so every generation, there has been a group of men who have tried to erode the rights of women in order to either control the way that they dress or control what they do or how they express themselves and so on. So like there's always been the sustained attack, and that's what the patriarchy does. It always seeks to, undermine women and women's place. But it's important for us to know that like the legacy of Muslim women, especially from the time of the Prophet, is one of empowerment. We know, for example, that the Prophet Muhammad would consult his wives about tactics, when he was going to war or going into battle. We know that his wives are people who guided the scripture and what people's practice of Islam looks like in the years after his death. We know that they had prominent roles in kind of leadership and so on. So we know that like women didn't have an inferior place in Islam. And we know that women actually challenged the Prophet a lot as well. There's this really interesting story in the Quran where a woman has been divorced by her husband, but he wants to change his mind, but he can't. And so the woman comes to the Prophet and says, look, this is the situation. Please help. I have children. I need this sorted out. And the Prophet's like, well, I can't do anything, right? She says, no, please, you must help, right? And she's like, he's like, well, I can't do anything, right? So she turns her hand up to the sky and she says, well, I complain to you, God. I'm complaining to you because I don't accept this. This is not fair. This is not okay. I'm in a really terrible situation. You need to do something. And almost immediately, the Prophet receives a revelation that speaks to her that says, to the woman who complained, this is my answer to you, So actually, even the scripture, even the Quran is actually shaped by women saying, well, I need my rights, right? You can't treat me like this. So that stuff is like a huge part of Muslim history and our legacy. And like nobody can take that away from Muslim women. The idea of the hijab is like really interesting because there's nothing in the Quran that talks specifically about a veil, What it says is that everybody should be modest. Like Islam is this religion that's really interested in modesty, not just in terms of our bodies, but in terms of our minds, in terms of the way that we behave. It's really interested in those sorts of things. So it does tell men and women to be modest in the way that you dress, but to be also modest with your gazes, modest in the way that you look. There is a verse that some people think or argue is about the hijab, but it's not. It's actually about imagine like the Prophet, he lived in a building that was kind of like part of the mosque.
Yeah.
And people would come in and out all the time, in and out. And there were times when he just wanted to be alone with his family, but the people would go, they would outstay their welcome. And so there is a piece in the Quran that comes and says that, when it's time, eat your meal and go, right? Leave him be. And if you want to speak to his wives, give them a piece of privacy by speaking to them from behind a curtain, right? So the idea of the word that they use it actually means curtain. It doesn't mean hijab. But then also there's this thing of like all the Prophet's wives ended up veiling, right? And so it became this like status thing to do. So lots of women then started copying the Prophet's wives because they wanted to be equal in status. It's like, imagine if everybody's got like Kardashian eyebrows and then everybody else was Kardashian eyebrows,
But yeah, I know what you mean. Totally.
And so that kind of thing, like everybody's like, well, I want a veil. And then when Persia became part of like the Muslim kind of empire or Muslim society, they saw there as well that the kind of the rich women, the high status women, they also wore the veil. So they started copying as well. Like, well, I want to show that I'm high status, so I'm going to wear the veil. And so over like the last 1400 years, the veil has then become kind of like mixed in this idea of what Islam is about or what modesty for women looks like within Muslim communities, but it's not a Quranic thing. It doesn't come from within Islam. So some people wear the veil because they want to, because they do feel it's from religion, or they do feel it's their expression of modesty or like God devotion, or some people wear it for political reasons, So it's not this idea that you have to wear it. The problem that we have is that men are constantly obsessed with the way that women dress, and Muslim women specifically, right? Because on the one hand, you get the Muslim men who feel that Muslim women must veil, right? But they can't decide what it looks like. Is it the headscarf? Is it the full niqab? They can't make their minds up. And then you've got like the Western man who feels that women, like Muslim women, shouldn't wear the veil at all. But at the end of the day, it's up to the woman to decide, whether it's an expression of Islam for her, whether it's not, is her thing. What I'm about is that, like, this shouldn't be used as a way to prove that Muslim women are inferior, and it shouldn't be, a way to denigrate Muslim women or to try and control the way that they behave. Yeah.
Absolutely. There was a question here from Sarah who says hijab was and never will be a fashion statement in Islam. The Quran is very clear about what constitutes as a hijab. There are discussions about the face veil. I
think that we know, like, historically we know that this is how it was, that there was a Persian influence in terms of status and the way that women veil there. We know that what Prophet Muhammad's wives were considered examples to emulate. I personally disagree, and I also, when I say the stuff that I do in the book, I rely on feminist scholars who have done the work, who've done the interpretation, and who say that in their interpretation, that particular verse is not about the veil.
Okay. Sarah, maybe when you get the book, which is out in all good bookstores now, then we can have more of a detailed discussion about it. But we're all learning, and we're not all going to have the same opinion. So thank you, Sarah, for that, and thank you as well, Tawssef, for answering that. And we're coming up to our final myth-busting one that has so much controversy. It is crazy. Like, I don't know I don't even know where to begin with this one. But apparently, Islam is homophobic. They hate trans community. They just hate anyone that's in a same-sex relationship. They want them thrown off walls, beheaded. What's going on?
Well, the LGBT one is like a really interesting, really complicated one. We always think about Muslim societies or Muslim communities as being ones of like blanket intolerance, which when you start looking through history is not true. Right? I think the most important thing for us to understand when we talk about like homophobia and transphobia is that LGBT, the idea of like LGBT identities, is very recent, right? It's only from like the 1800s that the concept of like sexuality as an identity came forward. So for most of like Muslim Islamic history, we've spoken about sexual diversity or gender diversity, not in the terms in which these things are talked about, right? We talk about LGBT people now, they were talked about differently then. I think the best place to begin is with this, that the Prophet Muhammad in his lifetime never condemned a person who either had feelings for a member of the same sex or expressed their gender identity in a non-normative or non-binary way. He never condemned them, he never punished them. There's no known instance of that. On the contrary, we have reports that he was, I'm trying to think of the right word, he was positive towards somebody who wanted to express his love to a member of the same sex. We know that people within his household who expressed themselves in a gender variant or gender diverse way. So we know that kind of exists. And then we have all of these like hundreds and hundreds of years of examples of Muslim societies that were kind of quite accepting of, kind of like homosexuality and some aspects of gender diversity and so on. We know that all exists. The kind of homophobia, it often exists from this idea that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is about LGBT people, right?
And is there, again, correct if I'm wrong, there's a hadith, which I wrote about in your book, that said men shouldn't act like women or something in the hadith. Is that correct?
Yeah, but let's stick with Sodom and Gomorrah, which is, the idea, like the Sodom and Gomorrah story exists in Christianity. I think it exists in Judaism as well. It's the idea that this was a city where people were queer and they were punished by like a hail of like fire and brimstone and so on. And God, killed them all because they were LGBT. There are other interpretations to that. So just as like queer Jewish people and queer Christian people have reinterpreted the story to think of it as one about rape, rather than a lack of consent. That also exists in Islam. There are lots of scholars who have talked about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah not being about LGBT people at all, but being about rape and sexual violence, about being about robbery and burglary. So when the Quran talks about it, it talks about Sodom and Gomorrah in many, many different ways. The people have done lots and lots of different things wrong, not necessarily just, sexual stuff, but they've like robbed people, they've rejected the prophet, Prophet Lut, and so on. So the story is actually much more complicated than people think. It's not this like clear-cut idea that LGBT people are the ones who are punished then. And it's also really interesting because even scholars like 800 years ago were having conversations about the story and saying that actually this story is not about sexuality. It's actually about, it's about the fact that they were inhospitable. It's about this, it's about that. So that stuff all exists. The really interesting thing about our society is that there's a difference between like how Muslims, like what Muslims believe often and how they live, right? So often, sometimes like Muslim societies, like the imams will say one thing, like, oh, you can't have sex with another man, but people just go ahead and do it anyway, right? And there's like hundreds and hundreds of years of where that stuff was happening. And there are also examples of where people were quite permissive about it. So, in the Ottoman Empire, for example, they allowed and decriminalized homosexuality in 1858. So if you imagine, like, the Ottoman Empire at that point is like most of the Middle East and Turkey and, maybe a little bit of North Africa. I don't really know like ancient geography that well. But in this huge region, homosexuality was decriminalized more than 100 years before the West, 100 years before the UK, which is major. How did I guess the like homophobia and transphobia come back in then, right? If we were heading that way, it's important to remember that when these parts of the world were taken over by the kind of colonial occupying powers, they brought with them Victoria era laws, right? So from the Victorian times, you have these like laws that are like against carnal offenses and so on. And these are the sorts of laws that exist in about 72 countries around the world. And most of those 72 countries happen to be British. And they were instituted by the British, and they're often still there. So the idea of like homophobia and transphobia it doesn't come from the West, but it was definitely like reinvigorated by the West, who were kind of appalled by the sexual permissiveness that existed in those societies and decided to kind of find a way to denigrate it. And the LGBT stuff was one of the ways. It's definitely true that a lot of homophobia exists within Muslim societies. Like all the statistics now, if you look at like the statistics on homophobia in Muslim societies in Britain, there's a lot of it, right? There are a lot of people who feel that it's not morally acceptable, but this stuff is changing, And if you look at, for example, statistics research that was done 20 years ago versus the research now, like people are not feeling that way the whole time. They are changing their opinions, and actually more young people are embracing LGBT people and sexual and gender diversity than their kind of predecessors. And also there are like really exciting things happening in different parts of the Muslim world. So for me, like obviously I'm Pakistani origin, so it's really interesting and really exciting for me to be able to say that in Pakistan there are examples of people being really like forward thinking on gender diversity. Pakistan is one of the very few countries that embraces the third gender status. It has a legal recognition for people who don't want to identify as male or female, but as a third gender. And that's like, there are about like 3 or 4 countries in the whole world that do that, and Pakistan happens to be one of them. It's kind of amazing, And we've got like imams in Pakistan who are talking about how we shouldn't be discriminating against LGBT people. So I think that this stuff is like really changing and really exciting, actually. I'm excited about that. It's it's moving in the right direction. It's not perfect. You know, we need to have more conversations about homophobia and transphobia in Muslim communities. Like our own communities need to do it. We need to be talking about the fact that LGBT people exist in our communities and they're not going anywhere. You know, and often they like either they live great lives or sometimes they lead really crappy lives, but they shouldn't have to. We need to be having those conversations. But I think that they're happening.
They are happening. And actually, just staying on this subject of LGBT in the Muslim community, there's two things I wanted to really get your steer on. One thing you talk about in the book is about LGBT people, their experiences of going into Muslim LGBT individuals going into more LGBT spaces and not still feeling welcome. So now they're brown, they're Muslim, they're LGBT, and they're still not feeling welcome. And also as well, the emergence of this weird symbiotic relationship between the far right and LGBT community. Apparently there's a relationship between those two.
Yeah. Well, let me give you an example then. I'll tell you the story that opens up the chapter on LGBT stuff. So when I was living in London in about 2008, 2009, I was living in East London in Tower Hamlets, and these stickers started to go up everywhere saying, this is a gay-free zone, arise and warn, this is a gay-free zone, like you will be punished, blah, 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 blah. It didn't get a lot of traction at first, but as they started to spread around Bethnal Green and Whitechapel, it became more and more controversial, right? People started getting really angry. The police started researching and they found the guy who did it. It was a Muslim guy. He got fined 100 quid. You know, he was acting alone, over. But the LGBT community in East London, and maybe like elsewhere as well, were mad. They were really mad. And so what they decided to do was organize a pride march in East London, which sounds really innocent, sounds really innocuous, but it wasn't, you know? These people, so I was involved in an organization that was kind of observing all of this stuff, and they saw what was happening, this East London Pride March, and all of these like East London LGBT organizations tried to get involved, right? They're like, yeah, well, we want to like participate, and we want this to be something that celebrates the really diverse community in Bethnal Green and Tower Hamlets and stuff. But these people weren't interested in like listening, weren't interested in having conversations about it, and they seemed not to be from London. Like these people were from outside, and they were planning to bring like coach loads of people from outside London to come in and do this march. So we were like, something's not right here, right? There's something really dodgy going on. Like, why won't these people talk to us? Why don't they want to be involved with the local communities? So my friend started doing some research, and he found that the founder was somebody that he knew, they were involved in the same transport union, RMT, and he was involved in the English Defence League. So he had explicit far-right connections, you know? And so then when we put this out into the media, it kind of like became this huge thing all over like the national press and the local press. And he resigned, and then his friends got really angry with us, like, oh, you're causing divisions. And it's like, well, mate, it's not us, right? We're not the ones causing divisions, it's you lot. And then they cancelled it. But in the end, we ended up doing like a different Pride March in it, and it was like really peaceful, and it involved loads of communities. It wasn't like a thing designed to show the Muslims that, no, this is our space so we can do what we want. It was about involving different groups of people together. So for me, this was like the first example of seeing this connection between like the LGBT communities and the far right. And that's the first time I've seen it, but I've seen it loads and loads of times before. You get these movements like, I think it's called Gays Against Sharia that I saw several times. Or you see the LGBT division of the English Defence League that would also organize like marches about, they hang gay people in Iran and la 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 and all of this stuff. And the sad thing about this stuff is that it always excludes the people who are in the middle, the people who are LGBT and the people who are Muslim, right? Because they go to kind of like mainstream spaces, they'll go to mainstream LGBT spaces, and they'll be told, well, you can't be gay Muslim, right? Like that's not right. You're condemned in your community, so why are you here? And then they go to like Muslim spaces, and often the Muslims are like, well, you can't be gay or Muslim, you've got to pick. So then these people are kind of like pushed out of two communities simultaneously, and don't really find a place where they belong. And that's a bit that I think is really sad, and something that we all need to think about, that when we perpetuate the idea that Islam and Muslim communities are homophobic and transphobic, we push those people who belong to those two communities simultaneously. And that's really sad.
No, absolutely. And I think you said this new weird relationship between the far right and the LGBT. Some elements of people, the LGBT community is known as homo national. You talk about in your book, and you know they're using that element to, is it recruit people to the far right, even though they are gay as well? Like that kind of blew my mind reading this book.
I think that, there are often people who are LGBT who might be queer, but their whiteness comes first.
Yeah.
And so what they want to do is to protect themselves, and they feel that as like gay or as white LGBT people, Muslims threaten their freedom. Mm-hmm. And so you can imagine it's quite easy then for people who are LGBT but white to feed into very, very kind of like white nationalist ideas of like the Muslims are attacking us, the Muslims are going to undo our rights, the Muslims can't be a part of our societies. And so the far right has successfully managed to play on LGBT people's fears about Muslim people. And that's why, there are I think maybe 20% of people voted for, 20% of LGBT people voted for Trump. A similar number of people voted for Marine Le Pen in the last French elections. People have said when it comes to, choosing, well, at least she is going to protect us, even though the far right hate LGBT people. They're only just trying this thing out, this temporary partnership, so they can get what they want. But in the end, they will also turn against LGBT people. So the idea of the coalition is never going to last. It's one that's completely self-destructive and yeah, super sad.
Absolutely. Thank you for breaking that down. I mean, man, we've been going in on it. I mean, someone in the group, in the chat, one book club member, Sophie Sal, said, interesting point about LGBT and BIPOC. A lot of her friends who are of colour and who have LGBT have experienced with racism and stigmatization within that community. So it just shows that you're just never, it feels like you're never enough. You're brown, you're Muslim, you're gay. Where do you fit in? And it's about, why do you have to take one element of yourself away to fit into any status within the UK? I just a thought I had, really.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, the whole point of the book is that we should never have to choose who we are.
Yes.
Right. Or what part of ourselves that we want to hold dear. So more broadly, for me, the book is about I want to be able to be the kind of Muslim that I believe in, but I also want to be a part of this society, and I value both of those things simultaneously. And it's the same with the subchapters. For LGBT Muslims, they want to be true to their sexual and gender identities, and at the same time they want to be true to their faith. Or for Muslim women, they don't want to have to feel that they have to choose between their religious identity and kind of the feminism and so on. So there is always this idea that Islamophobia is kind of always pushing us into a corner and making us feel that we have to choose, one or the other, Either it's, the values that the West claims to espouse, or it's our faith. And I'm saying that we can have all of those things simultaneously, and we get to choose. We get to do things on our own terms rather than people defining for us what Islam looks like or what life in the West looks like, Yeah,
beautifully put. I mean, I just really want to recap the 5 myths we've busted. We've talked about Muslims don't integrate. That's crap. Muslims are violent. I mean, one thing I want to say about this, I remember you said that when you were going to America, because of the humiliation that you felt at the customs, you made sure you shaved your beard and made sure you had a rucksack to make. I just thought that was awful.
Yeah, I mean, I always say that especially in those days, and maybe sometimes still, I always think about how I'm going to the airport and how I'm going to negotiate in airport space, right? I want to go to a space I want to go to the airport and go through security whilst looking as un-Muslim as possible, right? So in the early days, I would shave my beard off. I would make sure that I had nothing metallic. I would make sure that I was well dressed. I would, all of those things. If people ask me about what kind of job you would do, I would amp up the fact that I was a solicitor and had a PhD and blah, 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 anything just to get me through that space. And the kind of scrutiny that you feel that if you look or dress a certain way, you're going to be treated a certain way. And it's funny because my dad does the same as well. He always travels wearing a suit, right? Because he feels that he will be taken more seriously, dressed and appearing a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the burdens of being a person of color and a particular faith. So
Yeah.
I'm going to really just reel out what the 5 myths we talked about today are. And if you have any questions, it's your last chance. Please put them in the question bubble at the bottom on the right of your screen. Like I said, we talked about Muslims not integrating, Muslims are violent, Muslims are perpetrators, talk about the Asian grooming gang. Clearly, that is not true. Was Islam hates women or anti-women? Crap. And also as well, Islam is homophobic. It isn't. There are conversations that are happening. Talk about in Pakistan about how conversations are evolving. And I just wondered, like you talked about this book again, guys. For those who just come in or still around, the Muslim problem link in the video. And I just wondered, what is the key thing you would like people just to take away from this book?
I guess I want to talk. I want people to take away that, like, maybe people who are watching, want to reserve for themselves the ability to be as messy and as complicated as they are. Like, as human beings, we're all really messy, and I kind of want that on like a societal communal level. I want all Muslim communities to be allowed to be as messy and as complicated as they are without feeling like they're going to be judged. Like if one person does something wrong, they're going to be judged on behalf of the entire community. And I think that Muslims feel at this particular moment that we are constantly under attack. And the only way that we can change that is, one, by understanding Muslims communities a little bit better. But it's also about like affirming and allowing us to be human and to be messy. So I think that that's the big thing that I would like people to take away, that like, humanity is fundamental. We have to constantly affirm each other's humanity, even though I shouldn't have to ask for that. But at the same time, I would always say to people that if you feel like you don't understand something, or you feel like you're being told that that a community or a person is a certain way, I would ask myself why, or if you don't understand anything, I would ask myself why. I have this with so many things. Like, I'll be like, oh, okay, so the discourse is like this, right? It's telling me that I should feel this way about something. Or I don't understand why a community does this thing. Why is that the case? I don't then be like, okay, well, yeah, that community has something wrong with it. I try to understand what else is going on. And I think that we should be more curious about the narratives that we are given. And we should ask more questions about why we are being told to feel this way, or why we're being told to think this, and who is it coming from, and what are they projecting, what are they trying to hide? Because often when somebody is telling us something about a certain community, they're trying to distract from themselves, right?
Absolutely. I mean, a few people did send me questions, but you've answered most of them. The one that I just wanted to read out that somebody had asked in advance was, apparently, I know you're not a probate solicitor, but they said that apparently why is it that women in a family will inherit less than the male sibling? The feminist, it really irks me.
Yeah. So let me say, like, to begin with, I don't believe that there should be different rates of inheritance for men and women, right? That's my personal take on it from kind of my reading of the faith. But if you think about the context, right? Women are given the opportunity or the right to inherit when they didn't have any right. So when Islam came to Arabia, women had no right to inherit anything. And so when it did give them the right, it gave them like a slightly less, right? So I think like something, I don't remember the exacts, but men are given women get half of what a man gets, right? So I think like a man gets an eighth, a woman gets 16th. But a lot of this was down to the logic that a man would be responsible for raising a family. He would need that money, whereas a woman wouldn't have those financial burdens, right? But I think that also we have to think about this in terms of the spirit of the rule. What was the spirit of this? It was intended to give women a sense of like equality and having something when they didn't. But I think that what equality looks like now is entirely different. So I don't think that we have to make the same decisions. When the Quran says that women can inherit, we don't have to then say, okay, women can only inherit a 16th and they must only inherit less than a man, right? I will openly say to my parents or to my family or to my extended family that I totally believe that that men and women should be able to, inherit the same amount. And if I had children and I had a boy and a girl, I would, give them an equal amount. And I think that that's also like the area in which, or one of the areas in which Muslims are kind of having conversations about what it looks like to be a Muslim in the 21st century, right? Like we have this right, but maybe it's not completely okay for us now. We need to like tweak it a bit. So what does that look like now? And that's kind of one of the examples that, yeah, I would say like, well, we should be allowing men and women to inherit equally.
Absolutely. And there's another question that we have here. I think Aunt, you can see it as well. But what are your views on Muslims, particularly men, accessing counselling or therapy due to societal pressures?
I'm like really big on therapy. Having been there and done it, I think everybody should go to therapy, right? To try and have an understanding of who you are, how you feel, why you are the way that you are, right? Being able to be in touch with your emotions is really important. And I think that we in Britain, whatever your community, don't prioritize healing enough. Or if we do think about healing, we think about it in a very kind of like superficial way, like self-care. Oh, I'm gonna eat an ice cream and therefore I've like self-cared. But actually, what about like your mental health in terms of sitting with somebody who is, professional and qualified and really thinking about this stuff? I've done it. I spent like a lot of time having counseling and therapy, trying to understand who I am and why I am the way I am. So I would encourage everybody to do it, especially Muslim men. Why not? What do you have to lose apart from a better understanding of who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. And just a final question. I mean, I could be here all night, man. I just needed a drink of water. And, but my final question, at the start of this live, at the start of your book, you talk about, at age 14, you had denounced Islam. You were a pagan, allegedly. Like, that's what you've got. And obviously, that's just more of a comical element, but it's more about you've struggled with your faith, what it means to be a British Muslim in this space. Where are you now on that journey?
I would say that I'm in a very stable place when it comes to my relationship with Islam. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, right? Because the funny thing is that when I was writing it, I was like, why? Why me? Maybe I'm not the right person. I'm not a scholar of religion. I'm not a historian of religion. I'm not an imam. Like why me and why not somebody else? I'm not even like a public figure. So why should I be doing it? And the thing that I always came back to was that, well, I have a stable relationship with the religion. I don't question as much anymore. I can embrace the fact that often being a religious person involves lots of contradictions. I can embrace the fact that it involves different interpretations. For example, like the person who disagreed with me on the idea of the hijab, like that's her perspective, and if that's hers, that's fine. Like the way that a woman dresses doesn't affect me, as a man, and I don't want to police that. But I do want women to know that there are other interpretations should they want them, should they want to be empowered by them. So that's kind of the place that I came from, was that I have a stable, intellectually curious, but gentle relationship with Islam. And I think it's a good place to be able to speak to others from and to share with others and say that, like religion is complex, believing in God is complex. It's a journey, but like being kind to yourself, accepting often like maybe the most gentle interpretation, the middle way, the most compromising way, these things are okay. And it's really important to do your learning and to prioritize your, like, not only your emotional health, but your intellectual health, because it's the only way that I've like got to this point was by like reading my shit, knowing my shit, having conversations with people who were patient with me and, gave me the time and energy to let me ask questions about things that I didn't understand. This is kind of like my gift to people about like the stuff that I've been thinking about over the last 10 years. And so I feel really good about the book, but I also feel good about where I am in Islam, that even if there's like a bump in the road, like I will just try and like moor myself through God. And actually to say that, like that's the thing that I've been doing over the last year, right? Like in this pandemic, this stuff has been really crazy, right? It's really hard to deal with, so much anxiety. And the weird thing for me is that it's kind of like religion and God that is the thing that has kept me going. My friends keep telling me that like we should just accept the situation, right? You can only do your best and you can only accept what's going on, right? You can't control like if you're feeling anxious, you can't control if you're not sleeping well, you can't control what's going on outside your house, but you can just accept like what's going on. And that for me has been the thing that kept me like sane over the last year or so.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's so beautifully put. And I just want to say there's this Nelson Mandela quote that says, you know, no one is born hating an individual due to the color of their skin or their religion. And, you know, if people can be taught to hate, then they can learn to love. And I think that's what the heart of it is having that love for your fellow neighbor, your sister, your brother, biologically, whatever, non-biological, whatever. And I think if we come from a place of love and learning and humility, I think we will get to this post-racial society that I keep on talking about, and I believe we'll get there. But it's by doing the work. And here's one way of doing that, link in the bio, guys. It's also on Audible, Amazon, via Atlantic, the publishers. Thank you so much. And I hope you've enjoyed your first live, because I've enjoyed it.
Liz, I love it so much. You were so good. Such a great person to talk to.
Thank you
so much.
It's been a pleasure, and for everyone here as well. So thank you. And you know what? I'm booking you now. When book 2 comes, yeah, you're back here. You're back here, right?
Definitely.
Thank you.
Paperback. We'll do paperback for this.
Paperback's coming out, guys. This is the hardback, literally, for the hard-headed. And if you think, you know what, guys, I know this stuff anyway. He ain't talking nothing new. You know what? Buy it for someone who needs to know, or make it. This is a great Christmas stocking as well. So all my friends that are in the chat, you know what you're getting for Christmas, guys, man. But please do act. So thank you again. Much love. We appreciate this, honestly. Everyone's saying great conversation. This has been really good. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Anna, as well, for your support. But yeah, thank you, guys, and take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Just got to learn how to, I don't know how to switch it off. No, I'll press this. Oh, I found the word NBJ. Okay, take care.